because the production is far less than the interest. The interest is a multiple of it, And
Uh-huh.
what's more, we don't have to look very far around ourselves and see that this just doesn't happen for another reason, which even makes it more impossible. It's literally impossible for the banks to absorb that much, even if we could work for the banks that much. They just don't have
Yeah.
that much need, you see. So in fact, and my models account for this. I usually don't explain it because it's a further complication on the picture. But my models allowed for, and this is why I say it explicitly, by so much as periodic interest. In other words, that's the maximum. It's actually very little less than that, but which is exactly how much the debt increases, because there's only these very negligible things such as bankruptcy, unresolved bankruptcy, which decrease the debt on the other side of the ledger. They're very small until, of course, the whole system fails. But so Griffin produces this example, and this is the point of why I'm getting at this. I'm not, I have many plagiarists to cry foul against, but the thing is that people need to understand that there are arguments against these preposterous pretended authorities, and so this $80 example is preposterous because it isn't just that an exception could exist to the degree of $80 in one bank. That's the matter. It's the matter that if you're going to eliminate multiplication of indebtedness by interest, you have to demonstrate how it's possible for all of the interest to be reabsorbed into the economy without any borrowing at all. Because any borrowing at all increases the sum of artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation and inevitably results in terminal failure.
Right. Yeah,
And
but
when I
my point,
pointed
yeah.
this out to Griffin, what do I hear 2 years later? He's rewriting his book, Jekyll Island, which he plagiarized from Mullins, and the new book will be Jekyll Island Revisited, and he's claiming my thesis as his own without any credit whatsoever. So I prove him wrong, and he adopts my idea as if it was his, and that's what you're getting in case after case after case after case here. In this one program, we've covered the bases, we've given the solution, and we've shown how, in the end, all we have to do is transform this system into a mathematically perfected economy by refinancing our debt and crediting our accounts under mathematically perfected economy. So you
Yeah.
might ask, what's the other thing? How do we resolve all this debt to these banks? Simple. And as I said, I provide a way for each of us to do this as individuals under this mandate for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, which, if Canadians adopted it, would be a constitutional amendment for Canada. It's a constitutional amendment for the United States and every other country that the people adopt it.
Yep.
And so how this happens is exemplified by my article, If I Were President. Instead of as a president, we would be doing this as individuals. You would go into your bank, ask to see your loan officer, and you would do as we provide ourselves the right to do, and that is challenge this obfuscation of the currency. We're challenging the obfuscation of the currency two ways: by its logic and purported justice on the one hand, and if it is logical or justified on the one hand, then we are challenging it likewise on a legal level. What do I mean by this? in this article, If I Were President, I tell if I were elected president, I would, by a stroke of the pen, immediately upon taking my oath of office, I would take a piece of paper out of my pocket and I would write across it, "Will pay to the bearer on demand." And I would sign it, Mike Montagne. And I would present this to the Secretary of the Treasury to give it to the Federal Reserve System and the entire dependent banking peripheral banks, and as a resolution of all public and private debt.
And that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually the perfect thing to do.
It sounds ridiculous only to the simpleton who hasn't absorbed any of this, because it's exactly what the banks said. In fact, I participated in some meetings of the Icelandic Financial Reform Initiative, and I explained to Iceland exactly how to resolve its debts months ago. And it was the exact same way. And several of the people at this meeting were software engineers, and they all laughed because they realized that it was exactly right. It was so simple, and it covers all the bases. Here's the thing. If the banks can just publish our evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, under United States law, no private citizen can be awarded any powers or private authorities that are denied to anyone else. And so we have an equal right to issue our own promissory obligations. And if the bank has obfuscated this into a debt to the banking system, although the banking system hasn't even given up any lawful consideration, obviously we're at least equally entitled to do so ourselves. You see?
Yeah, so we're going to do to them in one fell swoop what they did to us over 100 years.
If it's not a crime, and if it's not a crime, we have a right to do so. But
That's
we're
right.
not doing this to avoid our debts, because we're reducing our debts to what they would be under mathematically perfected economy by taking control of our government, giving them a deadline to create this monetary foundry and refinance our debts under mathematically perfected economy, counting all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, which itself eliminates most of all debt that's out there. Most people, on average, people have already paid for their home. They're not in foreclosure for paying $90,000 of principal off on a $93,000 property, which is a situation a friend of mine is in. They've been paying against this property. They paid almost all the principal off, and now, things have tanked out too bad, and they're behind on their payments, and they're losing this property, only owing a couple $1,000s in principal.
That's crazy.
So anyway, we're asserting this right. If they have the right, then we have the right. There's no such thing as other private citizens in the private. The Federal Reserve System is 12 private banks intentionally misnamed the Federal Reserve as a part of the deception. They're 12 private corporations. So anyway, we have the right if they have the right. On the other hand, if they want to contest, we also, on this affidavit that we provide to the banks to resolve our mortgages under this mandate for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, we also agree to contest the ostensible legality in court. The banks, if they want to contest it, are perfectly willing to do so. Okay? So this means for the first time ever, they actually have to justify what they're doing. And guess what? This has already been tested in the case that I prevailed in. In our bicentennial year in 1976. But nonetheless, the issue is just the same whether or not I'd ever done so or not. And that is that we're allowing the banking system to come into court and say, okay, what lawful consideration did you give up in this ostensible debt? And how is it that you're not just merely the publishers of evidence of our promissory obligations to each other? How is it any debt is owed you? Rather, is it not true that instead the obligation is to pay and retire principal from circulation? It's the property of no one. You gave up nothing of consideration either, which could be construed to be a risk against which you charge interest ostensibly to protect yourself. It costs you $2 to issue $100,000 into circulation, and you're charging $300,000 or $400,000 of interest on that $2. You see,
yep.
And we're forcing the banking system to come into court and contest it, and we're going to challenge them. Those are the questions that they're going to be asked. Those are the issues they're going to be required to prove or justified. And guess what? This is the last thing the banking system ever wants to happen. So on either account, we've resolved. If it's legal, we've resolved the debts, the purported debts to the bank. This isn't to escape them. We are reconstituting our debts under mathematically perfected economy to be exactly what they rightly are, and that is the unpaid principal. There's no debt to the banking system. There's no interest owed to the banking system whatsoever. All these people who are in foreclosure across the world now would instead, on average, be years ahead on their payments. Their house might even be completely paid for. This friend of mine has actually paid $250,000 on a $93,000 property. They're free and clear. Then instead of losing their property, they would have it. You see,
exactly.
And so, you know, to the tune of, we still have 10,000 homes a day going into foreclosure here. We have a backlog of foreclosures which haven't even hit the fan, so to speak, because the banks have to get rid of all their bad debts before they can process the new ones. I know of whole cities where, you know, 20 and more percent of the homes aren't even reported to be in foreclosure, but they are technically in foreclosure. They just can't be process his foreclosures because the banks can't sell the bad debts that they have on hand at this time. You see, so the situation is far worse than the government or the banking system or the purported financial world, you know, or purported economists are telling us. And this solution is the only way, just as in a lawsuit where there's an injured party, this is the only thing that resolves all the issues to exactly what they ought to be.
It's totally true. And the thing is, though, is we got to move on it, and people need to be smart. They've got to, like in this case, for myself, you know, on May 2nd, they got a chance to make a statement that would be everybody in Canada would hear about it, because when a cabinet minister loses a seat to an independent, that's history.
Right. I wouldn't know about that, Jason, but I do know this. That you're running on a platform of mathematically perfected economy itself is history.
That's true.
You know, and I mean, there's people who would argue for this Bank of Canada that it was a solution, and these people, and I could name names, but I really don't want to offend them, even though they've borrowed from my work and whatnot. You know, the fact of the matter is, it wasn't a solution. There was a lot of things it doesn't account for, which we have to account for. There wasn't a way of transforming what's happened into what could be and rightfully would exist. And this is the whole resolution of this long-term engineering, which has never been invalidated even by these, you know, other, you know, purported authorities which have sprung up at the 11th hour here. So not only is it historic that, you know, you're running on a platform of mathematically perfected economy, that you're one of the first people that's, you know, willing to step up and, you know, run for office to achieve the universal objects of the Canadian people, which are the universal objects of the United States and every other country, a free country of the world, you know. So it's much more historic than that. It's also historic that, you know, the mainstream news, that why aren't you on the mainstream news across the world? Why doesn't the BBC and, you know, Al Jazeera and why do all the news in the world not report this immediately? Because most of the media is owned by the financial system. In fact, individuals own most of the media of the world. You know,
we actually live in, I mean, the media that's present in the city that I'm in. It's not the. We got a couple of local papers, and they are actually quite good and quite candid, and will report quite accurately what the things that I'm talking about. Which is definitely, though, like you're saying, not something that you would find being posted in the Vancouver Sun for sure.
Well, that sounds like an outstanding community, and I'm not really surprised, except that you know, I've been given the impression by other friends in Canada that, you know, over the years Canada has, you know, been in decline, which is much parallel to the decline, intellectual and moral or ethical decline that's transpired here in the United States. I mean, we're not the country that we were founded to be. You know, Benjamin Franklin left, I think it was the final constitutional convention, and a woman called out to him. She said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have they given us?"
A republic, if you can keep it.
Yeah, he replied, "A republic," and then he thought further and he says, "If you can keep it."
That's right.
You know, and that's so vital for any free society to perpetually understand that self-government is a two-edged sword. It isn't just to be enjoyed, however long it lasts. It's a responsibility to abide by the only principles that can serve the people. That isn't a huge thing. We've only allowed it to become a huge thing because all of these, purported representatives who are not our representatives have instead been put in office to perpetuate this ancient ruse, which eventually is to be eradicated from the face of the earth. Mathematically perfected economy it's not only simple, it's inevitable. One day, a higher people, only a little higher than we are today, will establish mathematical